All right. In today's class, we're going to be discussing the last of the substantive requirements for patentability, and that is non-obviousness. So for the purpose of patent protection, it's not enough that a patent claim is novel or merely novel, right? It also has to be sufficiently substantial that it wouldn't be immediately obvious to a FOSITA in the field in order to actually qualify for patent protection. And this non-obviousness requirement has been around for a really long time. In fact, it was developed by the Supreme Court and the lower courts in the 19th century when they essentially held that, again, mere novelty was not enough for patentability, and that a patent should issue and be valid only if the patent claim reflected more than mere mechanical skill, right? So in some early 19th century cases, for example, there was a really early kind of initial introduction of the concept of non-obviousness was in the Hotchkiss case, right? So in this situation, there was existing technology surrounding knobs, right? So there were knobs with straight rods, ceramic rods with straight rods, and there were metal and wood rods with dovetailed rods. And essentially what the Hotchkiss patent said was, well, we'll take the best parts of both and put them together, and therefore we'll have a patent. And the Supreme Court essentially said, no, that's not enough, because anyone who works in the area of putting knobs together would see that as being a solution to a problem that's just obvious. And so there's no reason to issue a patent for combining the two best features of existing designs that are already available. Similarly, a patent for combining a pencil and eraser, and you can see from the drawing anyway, that the configuration is a bit weird. It's sort of an eraser embedded inside the wood of the pencil here to be sharpened the way that the pencil lead would be. Anyway, again, rejected as being insufficiently or found to be invalid because insufficiently non-obvious, as reflected mere mechanical skill under the circumstances. And similar thing happened with a patent for dredging boat design. Okay. So why is that? I mean, why wouldn't we think, as a policy matter, why would courts adopt this kind of federal common law limitation on the scope of patent protection? After all, if something's new, then you're adding to the art, and why can't you get a patent on anything that's new? Why don't we just leave it at novelty? What do we need a non-obviousness requirement for? Well, the sort of policy thought is that the goal of patent protection, the justification for patent protection, is, again, encouragement of investment in innovation and providing an incentive to disclose new inventions. And if the invention in question is truly obvious, then the public really isn't getting either one of those from the patent document, right? It's not really encouraging investment in innovation because anyone who's a FOSITA in the art would be doing it anyway, right? They could just see it by virtue of the circumstances, and there's no need for patent protection in order to encourage investment in the innovation necessary to come to this new realization. In addition, it doesn't really do anything when it comes to disclosure, because anyone who's a FOSITA would already know that this is something you could do. So there's no real benefit to the public to extending patent protection to merely novel but obvious additions to the art. Now, the Supreme Court gradually kept developing this obviousness requirement further and further, and making it increasingly difficult to claim a patent protection. Probably, as the casebook notes, the Cuno case is a good example of the sort of high watermark of the non-obviousness doctrine prior to the 1952 Act, in which there was a patent relating to a electric car lighter, which combined two existing inventions into a new invention. And essentially the Supreme Court said, that's just not enough, right? these ideas were already out there. That's pure mechanical skill. And in order to get a patent, this is sort of the key language. They said there has to be a kind of flash of creative genius, right? You have to be doing something that hasn't been done before and that people couldn't figure out on their own. Like you saw something that no one else had seen, and then you did it. Okay, but again, it still raises this question, right? I mean, if no one had done it before, can't we draw an inference from the fact that it hadn't been done to assume that there was some sort of flash of creative genius? After all, it's everything seems obvious in retrospect. It's not necessarily obvious when you're wrestling with the problem. So one kind of approach that at least some courts took was to kind of draw an inference that if people had been trying to solve a particular problem, if Fauzitas had been wrestling with a problem and hadn't been able to solve it, then you could draw an inference of non-obviousness from the previous failures to realize the design in question. By implication, right, the idea would be that, look, I mean, if no one saw this as being a problem, or, it was a really quick succession of different inventions around the same devices, or just taking two bits and pieces of two existing inventions and combining them together in a way that, no one had seen as being worth bothering with before, well, then it might still be an obvious invention. Okay, well, in 1952, the Patent Act incorporated for the first time a statutory non-obviousness requirement, and it reflected the Congress's desire to kind of ratchet back what the Supreme Court had been doing with the non-obviousness requirement a little bit, to essentially say to the courts, you've taken this common law doctrine and gone farther with it than we think you need to. And in particular, they didn't adopt this kind of flash of creative genius idea, and sort of intentionally incorporated a kind of non-retroactivity element into the doctrine, right? So what are the elements? What do we look to statutorily when we think about whether or not a particular invention or claim is obvious? Well, we ask first, would it be non-obvious to a Fauceta, right? In other words, it's not from the average person's perspective, it's from the perspective of someone who's actually practicing in the art. In other words, is someone who's practicing in the art likely to look at existing inventions and say, yeah, this is an obvious way of combining them in a way that might be potentially effective or useful? Right? It's a negative requirement, right? In the sense that, you have to show that it would be obvious, not that it would be effectively non-obvious. And it's not one that we look at in hindsight, right? It's not like the fact that it's obvious now doesn't mean it was obvious when it was invented. And we can't impute kind of back to people in the past what we know today, right? In addition, it's objective, kind of looks at the question objectively and places certain kind of limits on what sort of prior art is going to be relevant to asking the question of non-obviousness. And we'll get to all those in a moment. Okay, so kind of key case in the Supreme Court's new reinterpretation of the non-obviousness requirement came in the KSR case. So what happened here, Teleflex owned a patent on a adjustable pedal assembly with electronic throttle control, and eventually sued KSR for infringement of their patent, specifically sued KSR for infringement of Claim 4 of the patent, which essentially claimed the combination of an electric sensor with a adjustable pedal device, along with the sensor being mounted in a particular way on the pedal in order to minimize fraying and damage to the sensor parts, right? And so KSR's response was, this patent's not valid because it was obvious to do these things, right? There's already patents out there that cover electric sensors in cars for use in acceleration. There's already patents out there that cover adjustable pedals. You know, two great tastes go get together. You put the two things together, and you end up with this patent, right? And Teleflex's response is, well, no, it's not obvious to put those things together necessarily. And also, it's not obvious to put them together in the way we did. In fact, there's an existing patent that puts the two together, but it does it in a different way that's not as effective as the way that we put it together. Well, eventually, SCOTUS agrees with KSR and says that the Teleflex patent claim is in fact obvious. And it points to the existing patents and says, look, these are two technologies that it was in fact obvious to put together. In fact, somebody else had done it and put them together. And the fact that the existing patent that combined the two, put the sensor in a different place, isn't enough, because once you could see the problems with the way it had been done, it would be obvious to do it in this new and different way. And so, the fact that somebody hasn't claimed this precise thing before isn't enough to say that it's non-obvious, right? The sort of universe of information available to a FOSITA under the circumstances would put a FOSITA in a position to know that this is a way of designing an automobile pedal that would be an obvious way to solve all these problems put together. And kind of implicit in the opinion is the idea that, look, there's lots of different choices you have to make in these kinds of designs, lots of different ways of putting things together. And if we presume that everything that hasn't already been done is non-obvious simply by virtue of the fact that people have done it different ways, well, what we're going to get is a proliferation over patents over every possible configuration. And the reality is, you're putting a car together, you're mixing, matching different pieces and parts in all different ways. And there would just be really too many patents covering too many things that aren't actually contributions to the field of automotive design. Okay. Moving on, in the St. Jude Medical v. Access Closure case, St. Jude owns 3 patents on different methods of essentially improved methods of taking blood and using a balloon to prevent, as I understand it, blood from escaping from the blood vessel. And they sue Access Closure for infringement. Access Closure says, look, all of these techniques already exist, right? Let's look back to KSR. All the different techniques that you disclose in this patent are already available. Therefore, you just took existing ideas that were already out there, put them together. That's not enough. That's obvious the same way it was in KSR. And the Federal Circuit disagrees, right? It says, true, all of these technologies were already existing and available, but they were used for different purposes, right? And so combining them in the way that they were combined was not obvious, because the technologies, as previously disclosed, were disclosed for use for a different purpose, right? And so what was not obvious about what St. Jude did was to use these new technologies to accomplish a different goal, right? In a different context, right? That changing context, that for use of the similar technology for a different purpose, means that the combination of these existing techniques, which in theory could be obvious if they were combined to do the same thing, is not obvious when the techniques are used to do something different. When they're combined in a new way for a new purpose, right? Then that change in the method and that change in the purpose enable the patent to clear the obviousness bar. In addition, because of the nature of non-obviousness and because of the higher bar than novelty, we have to think about prior art somewhat differently, right? So for the purpose of the novelty requirement, prior art from any field is relevant, right? You can't claim something in a patent if it's ever been disclosed ever for use in any context, right? So prior art for the novelty bar is universal across the body of granted and filed patent applications. But when it comes to non-obviousness, right, we narrow the scope. We don't look as broadly, right? We only look to previously disclosed inventions within the same field. Well, why is that? Well, because if inventions are in lots of different fields, presumably it would not be obvious to look to a different field for a technique rather than looking to the field in which you're already working. And in fact, the non-obviousness of looking to a different field would be enough to clear the non-obviousness bar itself. In other words, we want to encourage people to look outside the field of art in which they already practice in order to look to new techniques that they can incorporate into the area in which they're working. And at least a version of that, or arguably a stretch on that principle, is relevant in Ray Clay. So what happens here is a patent application for a essentially method of storing oil or other hydrocarbons in a tank. And effectively the patent says, well, use this gelatin foam mixture to fill up the empty space in the tank, and that'll, keep the oil better and more safely, and presumably stop it from degrading or something along those lines. And it's rejected on the ground that, well, use of foams to sort of fill dead spaces in oil storage units is already known in the art. Right? It's used frequently underground. You inject the gelatin foam substance when the oil is being stored underground. This is just doing the same thing for an oil in a tank, right? And on the surface, well, hydrocarbon storage, hydrocarbon engineering, it's all the same field. But the Federal Circuit says, no, under these circumstances, it was used for one purpose previously, right? So used for the purpose of improving oil storage underground. Using it for the purpose of improving oil storage above ground under those circumstances is not obvious because it hadn't been used in that way before, and therefore the patent should have issued after all and shouldn't have fallen afoul of the non-obviousness requirement.